Tonight, we dive into 3 Appalachian Mountains horror stories from the dark heart of Alabama, like the 28-foot monster hiding in the waters of Gadsden and the scale man terrifying locals in 10 islands. But first, we visit the Logan Martin Dam to see what's been terrorizing the community since 1964. I'm the Shadow Teller. Let the nightmare begin. Imagine being trapped in a pitch-black space where you can't even see your own hands, but you can feel something large, wet, and heavy bumping against your legs. Most of us would just flip a light switch or bolt for the nearest exit. But what if you were bolted inside a heavy metal suit 100 feet underwater, and there was absolutely nowhere to run? Meet Christopher, a young rookie diver. All he wanted to do was get through his first real shift at the Logan Martin Dam in Alabama without anyone finding out he'd lied about his experience to get the job. But it was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in 1969, and the surface of the lake was unnervingly still, until a shadow the size of a car glided silently beneath his boots, and his perfectly normal morning was about to become an absolute nightmare. It was 3 a.m. on a miserable pitch-black Tuesday in 1969. Christopher and his 3-man dive crew were living on a flat-top steel barge, anchored right against the massive concrete wall of the Logan Martin Dam down in Alabama. Christopher was the new guy, and the older guys were having a field day, relentlessly teasing him as they geared up. They kept slapping his shoulder, laughing and pantomiming a monster eating the rookie the second he hit the water. They had a brutal 12-hour shift ahead of them to patch a deep crack in the dam. To make matters worse, a tornado watch had been issued. The air felt incredibly heavy, casting a sickly, eerie green tint over the black water. Christopher's severe tinnitus was ringing a high-pitched whine in his ears, putting him on high alert. He clicked on his heavy flashlight and swept the beam across the muddy shoreline. A thick, metallic-smelling slick of bloody chum coated the water. Hundreds of mutilated, dead catfish bobbed lifelessly against the bank. Christopher's heart hammered against his ribs. He forced himself to look away, compulsively counting his heavy boots on the metal deck to calm down. 1, 2, 3. But as he reached the diving ladder, the flickering orange work lights hit the water, and just beneath the surface, a solid black shadow the size of a Volkswagen Beetle glided silently toward the barge. Christopher climbed down the metal ladder, and the black water swallowed him whole. 20 feet down. A huge smile spread across his face inside the dark helmet. He was actually doing it. He was diving the exact same dam his grandpa used to brag about welding. But back in 1969, this was arguably the toughest job on the planet. Christopher was bolted inside a massive canvas suit with a heavy copper hard hat and 20-pound lead boots dragging him into the abyss. His only lifeline was his umbilical, a thick bundle of hoses pumping in his air and radio comms, 50 feet down. That excitement twisted into a tight, nervous knot in his stomach. He had completely lied on his resume to get this job. If the boss up on the barge ever found out he was a total rookie with 0 real experience, he'd be fired on the spot. 80 feet down. The freezing water crushed against his body with 4 times the pressure of the surface. His chronic inner ear imbalance flared up, and a dizzying wave of vertigo spun his vision. 100 feet. His lead boots slammed into the thick bottom mud, but the exact second he found his footing, dozens of tiny, frantic tugs ripped at the canvas on his legs. Something was aggressively biting all over his suit. He awkwardly twisted his copper helmet around, and the shape swarming right behind him in the dark made the blood drain completely out of his face. The water at the bottom of the dam was completely choked with 0 visibility silt. It looked exactly like muddy chocolate milk. The moment Christopher tried to step forward, the dark water around him churned violently. 50 massive, aggressive catfish slammed against his heavy canvas suit, aggressively fighting each other to tear at the thick fabric. His claustrophobia spiked instantly. The heavy copper helmet pressed in on him, making every breath sound loud and desperate. To make it worse, the massive, low-frequency turbines of the dam were running nearby. The deep, mechanical vibrations pulsed right through the thick water and rattled directly against his ribcage. Panicking, Christopher fumbled for his heavy underwater torch and snapped it on. The blinding white beam pierced the muddy water. Instantly, the swarm of catfish scattered, darting away into the jagged, rotting branches of an underwater ghost forest left behind when the valley was flooded back in 1964. Christopher let out a long, shaky breath. He was safe for a second, and he knew his backup diver was up on the barge, ready to drop in within 60 seconds if things went bad. But just as his hammering heart started to slow down, a wet, blood-curdling scream blasted through his radio headset. Christopher frantically keyed his microphone, begging the guys up top to tell him what that awful sound was. Dead air crackled back through his earpiece. Nobody answered. He swallowed hard, desperately trying to convince himself it was just some weird catfish noise or a glitch in the radio static. He waded through the thick, muddy water to the massive concrete wall and found the jagged crack. Every muscle in his body stayed painfully tense. Down here, the ultimate killer wasn't the freezing cold or the dark. It was delta P, differential pressure. He knew that if a valve suddenly opened or a pipe gave way near him, the suction would pin him against an intake grate like a fly on a vacuum cleaner, crushing him instantly. For an agonizing hour, he chipped away at the patch job, but the vibrating turbines, the crushing pressure, and the suffocating isolation finally broke him. He keyed his mic again, this time pleading with the boss to pull him up. He didn't care that he was blowing his cover or that confessing his lack of experience meant he'd be fired the second he hit the deck. He just needed out. But right as he radioed for the surface, a massive, solid black shape materialized in the swirling silt just 5 feet away. The metallic taste of pure adrenaline flooded his mouth, and his lungs completely seized up, refusing to take in another breath. Christopher screamed into his microphone, begging the crew to haul him up immediately, but the radio just crackled with cruel laughter. The older guys up on the barge thought he was just making it up, teasing him for being a terrified rookie. He yelled back, pleading with them to pull him up right now, but before the crew topside even touched his rope, something else grabbed his line. A sudden, brutal force from below violently jerked Christopher 30 feet upward through the water. He was suddenly sitting at exactly 70 feet from the surface. His skull slammed hard against the inside of the copper helmet. The violent impact knocked his mounted headlamp completely dead, and total, suffocating darkness swallowed him. He scrambled blindly in the pitch-black water. His heavy canvas gloves frantically fumbled with the headlamp switch, smacking the side of the helmet to get it working again. In that terrifying moment, absolute panic flooded his veins, and his mind was screaming, "Oh my God, what just happened?" He never should have lied on his resume. He never should have taken this job. Please, God, just get me out of here. He was now pulled up to 60 feet from the surface as the crew topside finally started hauling him in. But then, the heavy rope violently snapped tight in the exact opposite direction. A massive weight dragged him right back down toward the deadly turbine whirlpools. 70 feet. Christopher thrashed wildly in his heavy suit, crying out in raw, breathless terror as the ultimate tug-of-war ripped him back and forth in the dark. 50 feet. The crew yanked hard and he was abruptly hoisted up. Suddenly, his helmet lamp flickered back to life, cutting through the churning mud. Right below his lead boots, a pale, scarred beast the exact size of a car materialized in the glow. A gaping, whiskered mouth wide enough to swallow a human whole rushed straight up at him, and Christopher knew in his final breathless second that he was going to be eaten alive. Christopher didn't get eaten that day. Miraculously, the crew up on the barge gave one final desperate heave on his safety rope and dragged him completely out of the water. He was immediately shoved into the decompression chamber to save his life. When he finally got out, pale and shaking, he quit on the spot. He swore to his boss that he saw a beast down in the muddy dark, large enough to swallow a human whole. Now, if you look into the history of the Logan Martin Dam, you'll find that ever since the valley was flooded in 1964, locals have whispered about this exact thing. There is a huge legend about giant car-sized catfish living down by the bottom grates, feeding on whatever gets sucked through the turbines. But scientifically speaking, that's just a myth. While blue catfish can easily grow over 100 pounds, a fish the size of a Volkswagen Beetle is pure modern folklore. It's just a spooky story told to keep boaters and swimmers away from the dangerous currents. So, it makes sense to just brush Christopher's story off as a crazy hallucination caused by the extreme water pressure and the terrifying darkness. But when the dive crew went to pack up his gear that night, all of their joking completely stopped. Because nobody could explain the massive, fresh, and completely unexplained dent crushed directly into the side of his heavy copper helmet. Have you ever been at a job where you felt like you had something to prove? Like everyone was watching you, just waiting for you to fail, so you were determined to do whatever it took to get the job done. Most of us would just work hard and hope for the best. But what if you were so obsessed with succeeding that you ignored every single red flag telling you that you were in serious danger? Meet Patrick, a 51-year-old surveyor. He was a guy who lived by the clock, and his only goal was to finish a mapping job on the Coosa River that several other men had already walked away from. But as he stood on the riverbank on a perfectly normal Thursday, he pulled something out of the water that didn't belong in this world, and his routine shift turned into a desperate struggle to reach the safety of the shore. It wasn't a dark and stormy night. It was exactly 6 a.m. on a completely unremarkable, stiflingly normal Thursday in the late 1800s. Patrick stood completely alone on the muddy banks of the Coosa River. He was a 51-year-old, highly educated surveyor brought all the way down from the north for one reason: to fix a massive problem. The construction of the Lock 3 Dam was severely delayed. The previous surveyor had just packed up and quit for completely unknown reasons. A few days later, several of the site workers did the exact same thing. They just walked off the job and never came back. Patrick's goal was to get the project back on schedule. He assumed the local crew was just undisciplined and superstitious, and he was determined to make up for the lost time, or the entire dam project would face another catastrophic delay. He rolled a ragged cigarette using Bull Durham tobacco, lighting it right off the cherry of his last one. Patrick was completely obsessed with time. He wound his heavy silver pocket watch exactly on the hour, utterly convinced that losing even a single minute of the day was a personal failure. He had hiked down the steep, rocky trail from the main camp long before sunrise, lugging his heavy brass transit, a canvas bag of wooden surveyor stakes, and a thick coil of sounding line. He purposefully left the crew behind because he wanted to work alone to avoid distractions. But right now, a blue wall fog completely swallowed the area they called the 10 Islands. Patrick stared into the thick mist, his jaw clenching in pure frustration. He couldn't see 10 feet in front of him, which meant his expensive brass transit was completely useless. This was why the project was failing, he thought. The fog was a physical barrier, actively preventing him from mapping the shoals and single-handedly halting the foundation work for the day. Patrick desperately needed to measure the chaotic riverbed to keep things moving. So he grabbed his heavy lead sounding line, stepped to the edge of the bank, and hurled it straight into the blind gray water. The rope zipped through his hands and went slack. It hit the bottom perfectly. But when Patrick pulled the rope back up, the lead weight wasn't covered in normal freezing river mud. Instead, it was completely coated in a thick, iridescent slime that smelled overwhelmingly like old, rotting copper. Patrick wiped the sludge off the weight with his bare hand. Now, a sounding weight is literally just a solid chunk of dead metal. When it comes out of a mountain river, it should be freezing cold. But the thick grease left on Patrick's skin was physically hot. And then, the slime actively pulsed against his palm, like a slow beating heart. A cold spike of adrenaline slammed into Patrick's chest. He dropped the heavy lead rope straight into the mud. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly tasting like pennies as a heavy, suffocating pressure washed over him. Something was staring at him through the thick fog. By mid-morning, the thick fog finally burned off. An iron-gray sky hung low over the Coosa River, turning the water into a heavy sheet of liquid lead. Patrick sat in the bow of a small wooden rowboat, while a local laborer named Thaddeus rowed him out into the churning current. Patrick grabbed a fresh, cold-sounding line. He didn't even look at the rope markers. He just dropped the heavy lead weight over the side. Thunk. The dull acoustic vibration traveled straight up the wet rope and into his calloused hands. 15 feet. He scribbled the depth in his ledger. Back on the muddy shore, massive steam-powered pile drivers slammed into the earth. The rhythmic, booming impacts violently shook the bedrock. That constant vibration traveled straight through the water and into the boat's thin wooden hull. The surface of the river actually danced around them, vibrating in unnatural, jagged ripples. Patrick closed his eyes, intensely counting the seconds between drops to calculate the river's speed. Therefore, he needed absolute silence. But suddenly, massive, heavy splashes shattered the water just outside his peripheral vision. Thaddeus gasped and dropped his right oar. The sudden clatter against the floorboards completely derailed Patrick's strict mental math. His frayed nerves finally snapped. Patrick whipped around and viciously screamed at the laborer for ruining the count. He fully expected the local man to shrink back and apologize. But Thaddeus wasn't looking at Patrick at all. His jaw hung completely slack, and his chest heaved with short, panicked breaths as he backed away from the edge of the boat. Just below the surface, violent churning bursts of thick yellow sulfurous bubbles erupted from the muddy riverbed, rising straight up toward their thin wooden hull. And the trail of boiling water was moving against the current, tracking the boat perfectly. By early afternoon, the iron-gray clouds burned away, leaving behind a brutal, suffocating heat haze. Shimmering waves of heat rose off the exposed river rocks. The thick air violently distorted the shoreline every time Patrick tried to line up a measurement through his brass transit. Patrick stood on the edge of the supply barge, furiously scratching complex flow rate calculations into his ledger while simultaneously shouting at the site foreman. The heavy-suit divers, the men paid to go down and build the underwater foundations, were sitting on the muddy bank, refusing to put their brass helmets back on. They were completely paralyzed by fear, but Patrick was the ultimate skeptical rationalist. He didn't view their terror as a real human emotion. To his deeply analytical brain, their panic was just a frustrating mathematical variable ruining his schedule. He loudly dismissed their dread as uneducated mountain talk and cheap local superstition, waving his ledger in the air. So, to prove the river was completely safe and force the men back to work, Patrick made a terrified Thaddeus row him straight out into the deepest, most dangerous part of the shoal. Thaddeus's arms shook badly, but he rowed. Patrick grabbed the heavy iron anchor and heaved it overboard, proudly calling the crew's bluff. The boat jerked hard and settled against the heavy current. Patrick stood tall in the bow, smirking at the men on the shore. But a second later, a deep, hollow voice began to echo across the water. Patrick scanned the banks, his permanent squint wrinkling in frustration, trying to find the man playing a trick on him. The voice wasn't coming from the shore. The wet, gurgling words were vibrating directly through the damp wooden floorboards, right beneath Patrick's leather boots. The sun finally started to drop below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the Coosa River. Swarms of tiny, biting gnats aggressively targeted Patrick's eyes and mouth. He violently swatted them away. His permanent squint wrinkles, deep crow's feet carved into his face from years of staring through brass lenses, tightened in pure frustration. He was done playing games with these superstitious locals. He reached into his gear bag and grabbed his underwater spyglass. It was just a long, hollow metal tube with a thick glass lens sealed at the bottom. He leaned over the edge of the boat and shoved the tube deep beneath the churning surface to check for rocks. The murky, sediment-filled water instantly cleared through the glass. 10 feet down, standing perfectly still on the muddy river floor, a massive humanoid figure, completely covered in shimmering fish-like scales, stared directly up at him. Patrick's breath instantly locked in his throat. The suffocating heat of the afternoon completely vanished, replaced by a sudden freezing chill that dropped like a stone into his stomach. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy metal tube rattled loudly against the side of the wooden boat. He violently yanked the spyglass out of the water, desperately gasping for the air his lungs had just forgotten how to take in. His deeply rational brain immediately tried to categorize the monster as just a weird trick of the dying light. He took a shaky breath, forcing himself to believe he was completely safe. But right as his breathing started to steady, the entire wooden boat violently lurched to the left as something massive and incredibly heavy grabbed the keel directly beneath his boots. Night fell entirely over the Coosa River. The water turned pitch black, instantly transforming into a graveyard of floating debris. Rotting deadheads, heavy waterlogged tree trunks, bumped violently against the side of the wooden boat. In the dark, the thick bobbing wood resembled bloated torsos drifting in the current. The boat tilted dangerously toward the water. Patrick didn't wait for the creature to surface. He scrambled frantically over the wooden edge and threw himself onto a nearby shoal of moss-slicked stones. Vibrant green slime coated the rocks, making his footing incredibly slippery. His knees slammed hard into the stone, tearing his canvas trousers. But instead of running blindly for the shore, Patrick's deeply ingrained, obsessive engineering brain took over. His hands shook uncontrollably. He yanked a silver flask of high-proof corn whiskey from his heavy coat, his daily medicine for the damp river air, and took a massive burning swallow. Leaning into his permanent surveyor's tilt, he balanced on the slick rocks and flipped open his leather notebook in the moonlight. Relying entirely on his cartographic memory of every single sounding drop he took that morning, Patrick frantically scribbled complex math equations. He was calculating the exact flow rate of the river against the size of the scaly creature to determine its maximum swimming speed. He scratched the final number onto the paper. The math clearly proved the creature couldn't possibly move fast enough against the heavy current to reach his rock. logic was victorious. So, he slammed the notebook shut, completely confident he could just walk away safely. But right as he turned toward the shore, a massive, wet, scaled hand slapped down onto the stone exactly 1 inch from the toe of his leather boot. Patrick didn't try to recalculate. He scrambled violently backward up the slippery rocks, completely abandoning his heavy brass transit and his leather notebook. He sprinted blindly through the dense, dark woods toward the main construction camp. Thick briars tore at his canvas trousers, and his boots slipped in the deep mud, but he didn't stop to look behind him. He burst into the main clearing, his chest heaving as he gasped for the damp night air. A massive bonfire roared in the center of the camp. The terrified heavy suit divers huddled around the flames, completely silent. When Patrick stumbled out of the tree line, every single man turned to look at him. Because Patrick was the highly educated engineer, the man who didn't believe in anything you couldn't measure, the entire camp waited for him to explain what was happening down at the river. Patrick needed to regain control. His hands trembled wildly. He reached instinctively for his heavy silver pocket watch to ground himself in numbers and logic, the exact same watch he obsessively checked all day long. His fingers brushed empty fabric. The thick silver chain was snapped in half. The watch was completely gone. A cold wave of dread washed over him, but his stubborn pride took over. He opened his mouth to lie to the men. He was ready to tell them it was just a mechanical anomaly, so he could force them back to work. He stepped fully into the bright orange firelight to assert his authority. But before Patrick could speak a single word, the divers scrambled backward in absolute terror. They weren't looking at the dark river behind him. They were screaming and pointing directly at Patrick's heavy canvas coat, which was now completely plastered in hundreds of massive, shimmering fish-like scales. So, what exactly happened to Patrick out there on the Coosa River? If you look into the actual history of the 10 Islands area in Alabama, the construction of the Lock 3 Dam really was plagued by massive, unexplained delays in the late 1800s. Crews were constantly terrified of the water, and many workers just packed up and left without a word. For decades, locals living in the deep Appalachian foothills around the river have swapped stories about massive humanoid river monsters stalking the muddy shoals. Now, a lot of highly logical people have tried to explain away Patrick's terrifying encounter. They point out that the Coosa River is home to the alligator gar. These are actual real-life prehistoric fish that can grow up to 10 feet long, and they are completely covered in thick, armor-like scales that look almost reptilian. Some people think Patrick just saw a giant gar standing on its tail in the murky water. Others think the explanation is even simpler. They say the thick sulfur gas bubbling up from the riverbed just poisoned the air, causing Patrick and the local crew to suffer from severe, shared hallucinations. Those are perfectly reasonable explanations if you want to sleep well at night. But a giant fish doesn't have hands that can grab the bottom of a boat. Hallucinations don't leave thick, hot, pulsing slime on a piece of lead. And the history books still cannot explain how a highly educated, strictly analytical engineer stumbled out of the dark woods, completely covered in hundreds of massive, shimmering fish scales. Patrick never went back to the river, and the Lock 3 Dam project sat abandoned for years before it was finally finished. Have you ever been out with your dog, and suddenly they just freeze, plant their paws and stare into the dark like they see an invisible monster? Most of us would just trust our pet, turn around, and go right back inside to the safety of our living room. But what if you were totally isolated in the deep wilderness, miles away from help, and you just ignored their warning? Meet Virgil, a 57-year-old expert fisherman. All he wanted to do was head out on the water to catch a catfish as a simple parting gift for his neighbors. But he pushed his tiny wooden boat out into the dark, flooded Coosa River anyway, and his perfectly normal weekday evening was about to go horribly, terribly wrong. In July of 1877, life down in the South moved incredibly slow. It was just a regular quiet weekday evening, and Virgil was completely alone. He was out in the deep isolation of the Coosa River basin near Gadsden, Alabama, miles away from anyone else. Virgil was a 57-year-old widower who always wore his gold wedding band on a dirty piece of string around his neck, and he was an absolute expert fisherman. He had one simple goal for the night. His neighbors, the Millers, were packing up their wagons to move out west the very next morning. Virgil wanted to catch a massive flathead catfish to pack their icebox as a final parting gift. Standing on the muddy bank, totally surrounded by thick trees and dead silence, he spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the weeds. He stared at the dark water and muttered his golden rule: "The river only takes what you let her take." Virgil was a lanky guy, standing 6'4", but barely weighing 160 pounds. His oversized rubber boots made a heavy slosh thump sound in the mud as he prepped his leaky old wooden skiff, the Lily. He finished loading his heavy iron-weighted nets into the back, turned around, and slapped his leg to call his scruffy terrier, Anchor, into the boat. But Anchor just stood there. The little dog planted his paws in the muck, his body going completely rigid. He refused to step even 1 inch closer to the water. Virgil just shook his head, brushing off the dog's weird warning, and pushed the skiff off the bank. The boat glided smoothly out into the dark, heavy current. He was totally safe, just floating along. But as Virgil rowed, a high-pitched, panicked whine echoed across the water, making him freeze. Anchor was pacing the shoreline, staring directly at the exact center of the river channel. Once Virgil got out into the deep channel, he slipped into an intense hyper-focus. Hours passed. He completely forgot to eat his packed supper or even take a sip of water. He just narrowed his right eye, squinting like he was looking through a telescope, hunting for the absolute perfect fishing hole. His thick, scarred hands, covered in tough yellow calluses, readied the heavy iron nets. Then the blue hour hit. It's that specific, creepy twilight where the shadows stretch out long and you just can't trust your own eyes anymore. Long, pale, weeping willow branches reach down to the water like skinny fingers, constantly snagging and pulling at Virgil's fishing lines. He found a deep, quiet bend that looked like a guaranteed catch. He rowed the Lily over and tied his heavy rope to a thick, dark stump poking right out of the water. Recent summer rains had made the swelling river angry. The water rushed violently downstream, dragging massive logs and heavy debris past him. Virgil pulled his knot tight. The old wooden boat finally stopped rocking and stabilized against the heavy current. He settled back onto his wooden bench to wait. But a sudden freezing chill hit the air. The river was roaring past his boat, pushing everything downstream. So why was the stump he was tied to slowly dragging his skiff upstream? Virgil was a deeply superstitious man. He always called the river she, and he absolutely never whistled while out on the water. It was just begging for bad luck. Instead, to pass the time in the dark, he used a perfect bullfrog mimic he had mastered over the years. All around him, a deep, guttural chorus of real bullfrogs provided a steady bass track to the quiet evening. Then a heavy fog, the kind locals call a river coat, rolled in out of nowhere. The thick white mist sat exactly 3 feet off the surface, completely hiding whatever might be swimming just below. A few fireflies blinked around the boat, their tiny yellow lights completely failing to pierce through the dark water. Virgil puffed out his cheeks and let out a loud, perfect croak. Almost immediately, a massive bullfrog nearby answered him back. He grinned until a random, freezing pocket of air slammed into the boat, cutting right through the sweltering July heat. Instantly, every single frog in the river went dead silent. A heavy, unnatural quiet dropped over the water. It was a total dead zone, where all the wind and animal noises just stopped existing. Virgil's heart hammered against his ribs, and he quickly grabbed his wooden oars to get out of there. The water beside his boat swirled and bubbled up, like something huge was rising right under him. He braced himself for a massive alligator, but what kind of alligator leaves behind a nauseating, metallic stench of ozone? Virgil's left eyelid fluttered wildly, a nervous tic that always flared up when he was completely exhausted or terrified. Dense clouds of mosquitoes suddenly descended, swarming so heavily they looked like thick black smoke rising out of the river reeds. Right where the unseen creature had just submerged, an oily, rainbow-colored slick spread rapidly across the dark water. Virgil reached up with a shaking hand and tightly clutched the tiny leather-bound pocket Bible, tucked safely in his breast pocket, bracing for the worst. He violently yanked his heavy wooden oars backward to escape. His chest heaved as he rowed, and he started praying to God, just absolutely begging to live. He was pleading under his breath, completely freaked out and desperate to just get out of there alive. The old skiff surged hard toward the safety of the Gadsden shoreline. Loud, cracking timbers echoed through the thick fog. The Lily groaned under the immense pressure of a massive, unnatural water current, displacing right beneath the hull. He thought he was just dealing with a freakishly large gator, but then the sky lit up, revealing a nightmare that completely shattered his reality. Silent sheet lightning flashed bright white across the night sky, illuminating the river for one split second. A massive, serpent-like creature, easily 28 feet long and as thick as a whiskey barrel, loomed directly over the tiny skiff. Virgil suffered from severe ophidiophobia, a paralyzing, deep-rooted terror of snakes. Looking up at this leviathan, his brain completely short-circuited. He couldn't speak. He couldn't even draw a breath. His entire body shook so violently, he dropped his oars, and a warm wave of urine soaked his trousers as his vision tunneled, nearly passing out from the sheer mind-breaking terror. The giant mass crashed down, instantly splintering the Lily into firewood and plunging Virgil deep into the freezing black river. He thrashed his way up to the surface, gasping for air in the violent current, and scrambled frantically toward the bank. He finally pulled himself out of the water and collapsed onto what he thought was land. He was on his hands and knees, frightened, crying, completely exhausted, and panting heavily as he desperately tried to crawl away into the reeds. But as he pressed his hands down to push himself up, he realized the solid mud beneath him was shifting and sliding, exactly like massive breathing scales. Pure adrenaline completely took over. Virgil scrambled off those massive shifting scales and thrashed wildly through the muddy shallows, abandoning his nets, his ruined boat, and the neighbor's parting gift. He clawed his way up the steep clay bank and sprinted straight into Gadsden. He burst through the doors of the local fishing warden's office. The dry, sharp smell of stale coffee and cheap cigar smoke hit him, a stark contrast to the foul swamp water dripping off his clothes. He slammed his bruised hands down on the wooden desk, screaming about a 28-foot snake. The warden took one whiff of the river sludge and dark tobacco juice, writing him off as a panicked drunk. But Virgil reached right across the desk and grabbed the lawman by the collar. His wild, unblinking eyes forced the warden to take it seriously. The lawman grabbed his brass oil lantern, pulled his shotgun off the wall, and chambered 2 massive slug rounds. They arrived back at the Coosa River, just as a blood-red sunrise bled across the sky, casting an eerie crimson glow over the water. The warden swept his lantern over the muddy banks. There, washing up against the reeds, were the splintered, slime-covered remains of the Lily. The heavy wooden boat was completely destroyed. The physical proof was right there. The warden instantly leveled his shotgun at the water, ready to fire. But the river was dead calm, reflecting the morning sky like glass. There was absolutely nothing in sight. The ruined boat officially sparked a massive newspaper frenzy, igniting a brief period of monster fever all across town. Virgil just stood on the bank, staring out at the empty water, and thought about his golden rule. The river only takes what you let her take. Now let's look at the actual history of this case, because this wasn't just some local tall tale. In the summer of 1877, the local newspapers around Gadsden completely blew up with reports of the Coosa River monster. People were terrified to even go near the water for months. But of course, whenever something this strange happens, critics immediately try to explain it away. Let's look at their theories together, because they just don't add up. First, the doubters claimed Virgil just saw a massive alligator gar or a river sturgeon. Sure, those fish can get huge, but a 28-foot-long fish that is as thick as a whiskey barrel? That breaks every biological record in history. Plus, fish don't leave behind a blinding rainbow-colored oil slick or smell like metallic ozone. Then, people tried to say it was just a massive, waterlogged tree trunk moving in the flood. But think about it. How does a dead tree swim upstream against a violent, rushing current? It's physically impossible. Finally, folks just tried to write Virgil off as a panicked man who wrecked his own boat. But the local warden saw the wreckage himself. The Lily wasn't just banged up on some rocks. It was completely splintered into kindling by immense pressure, pushing up from underneath the water. To this day, nobody can actually explain what destroyed that boat. But if there is one lesson to take away from Virgil's terrifying night on the Coosa River, it's this. If your dog ever plants its paws in the mud and absolutely refuses to get in the water, you should probably just listen to your dog. If you would like to hear more Appalachian Mountains horror stories, click here. I'm the Shadow Teller. Stay safe in the dark.